Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I also want to thank you for allowing me to uh, share my ideas with this RIETI audience. Title of my talk, Digital Transformation, Future Globalization and Future Work. So based on a book I published in 2019 called The Globotics Upheaval, which has been translated into Japanese, and you can it's published with Nikkei. So my talk is going to have three parts, quite naturally. I'm going to talk a little bit about digital transformation. I could go on for hours about this, and I'm sure everybody else on our panel could go on for hours, but I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to kind of keep it short, and I'm only going to talk about the parts of digital transformation that I think are most important for future globalization and future work. And then I'm going to talk about future globalization and then future work. So here we go with digital transformation. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that computers have acquired new cognitive capacities due to learning, machine learning. So many people will say, hey, artificial intelligence is a big thing, but I think it's really worthwhile remembering or focusing on machine learning as the key breakthrough. Now, one way to explain this is to use this framework that Daniel Kahneman used to look at the way humans think. And he called it thinking fast and thinking slow. And he, as many other psychologists point out, humans have these two very different ways of thinking things, which allow them to do two very different cognitive tasks, in other words, mental tasks. So the first one is thinking slow. And that means it's effortful and it's conscious and it's difficult to do. It's like when you try to do arithmetic or you try and figure out the scheduling of a meeting with many people together. It's complicated, but you're following a conscious logical process. And since it was conscious and logical, people could turn that into a computer program, and therefore computers could automate those sorts of tasks. And of course, we have all sorts of software going way back to the 70s, which help us automate those kinds of thinking slow tasks. But many of the things we do as humans are thinking fast tasks. And that is, they involve unconscious thought. So when we listen and we recognize language and we know what's going on, that connection between the sounds that come into our ears and the language that appears in our brain, that's unconscious. We do not know how we do it.
Richard, sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
could you turn on your slide?
Okay, now can you see it now? Is that okay?
Yes, no, it's okay.
Okay, good. So there we go. And so I was on to thinking slow. So things like natural language recognition, visual pattern recognition, moving over unknown territory, reacting to input. Those are things that we do not know how we do. And before machine learning got really good, computers couldn't be taught to do that. So now many computers are being programmed, in essence, with machine learning, which means you take a great big structured data set on something, and structured data set means that the question is very well defined and the outcome's well defined. And if you have a large enough structured data set, computers can now essentially set up a large statistical model to guess what the right answer is, given any new situation. Now, what that means is that computers have been able to take over some thinking processes, some cognitive capacities that they never had before. So that's why you can talk to your smartphone, and it's why you can use spell checking that becomes so good. You can do automatic machine translation. There's a visual pattern recognition. It's why the iPhone, for instance, can look through your photos and put together a nice project, because they've adopted some of the thinking slow or thinking fast tasks that didn't exist before. Now, it's important to say that because since about 2016, it's possible to automate a whole set of jobs that weren't automatable before, and that's changing both the nature of globalization and the nature of the future of work. So let me go to the next slide. The second thing that I'd like to focus on is that the digital technology is unbundling the service value chains. So service value chains, not global value chains. Global value chains is almost universally referring to manufactured goods. So unbundling the global value chain in autos means certain parts are made in different places. And what I'd like to point out here is that digital technology has enabled an unbundling of service value chains. So this is digitally enabled coordination in particular, unbundles the service value chain. Now, what I want to do is make a little example of this. So what I have here is the recruiter's value chain, the task sequence that you need to recruit a new employee. So the recruiter will conduct a needs analysis inside the company. What kind of person do you need? He conducts market research, looks for candidate sources, screens his candidates, evaluates the competency, gets the candidate to make a presentation, interviews the clients to see what they want, reference checking, offer negotiation, and follow-up calls. So all that is a value chain in a service industry. And not too long ago, all of that would have been done by the same company in the same office, or at least probably in the same building, and frequently would have involved people walking between offices with folders full of CVs and evaluations, et cetera. But because of digital technology and the collaborative software, these tasks can be broken up, and some of them can be offshore or automated. And that's what's been happening. So service value chains disintegrating opens up the possibility that some of those tasks will be offshored abroad in exactly the same way that the unbundling of, say, the auto sector allowed some tasks in the construction of Toyota cars to be done in Manila or Vietnam rather than in Nagoya, Japan. So the same sort of unbundling of the offices is opening the door to offshoring going forward, and automation. And lastly, digital technology is making remote workers less remote. So there are four things I want to focus on. And of course, COVID has completely accelerated this. The first is a coordinated shift to telework. So COVID has moved the entire world to getting used to working online, at least in many office jobs. Now, the point there is if it's teleworkable domestically, there's a tendency for it to be teleworkable internationally, although of course there's some differences. Now that is pushed forward by advanced comms. Right now, today, we're using what isn't really that advanced, and it kind of existed last year, but it wasn't quite as good. But coming along are things like augmented reality or virtual reality, which will make it seem like much closer that you're actually there. And there's also an existing but rather expensive technology called telepresence, where you feel already you're almost in the room with the people. So all those things are making it easier to put together a team of service workers, some of whom are remote, some of whom may be in a different country. The online software suite, collaboration suites, that's made it much easier to coordinate the teams, and machine translation, at least in the major languages in the world, are making it easier for people who aren't native speakers of English or Spanish or French, whatever, to work with other people who are also not native in their own languages. So all this digital technology is essentially opening up a whole set of possibilities and transforming both globalization and the future of work. So let me talk about how this works. This is a summary slide, this basic message of my book. So this digital technology is launching what I call globotics, which is the combination of globalization and robotics, where I'm talking about software robotics, not hardware robotics. So software that's used in offices, not robots that are used in factories. So this globotics is then displacing white collar and professional workers, some of it automating jobs away and transforming work due to automation of service jobs. And some of it is offshoring. That's just starting to go. But that's the upheaval part, is at least in the rich countries, this will, I believe, disrupt work patterns in offices in a similar way that globalization and automation disrupted work in factories the last 2.5 decades. So future globalization. Think services, not just goods. So what all this digital technology is enabling, or at least especially enabling, is trade and services, where people sit in one country and work at offices in another country. So this digitech is enabling arbitrage of the vast international wage differences in office and professional jobs. So for example, I make something like 10 times more as a professor of economics in Geneva than a professor of economics in Manila would make, even though they're doing essentially the same thing. They're teaching students about economics and things like that. But it's difficult to arbitrage that difference right now because to a large extent, we used to think that education services were largely non-traded. We used to think it was really important to have people actually in the classroom. And what COVID has taught much of the whole world is actually educational services, although they're somewhat inferior when delivered online, it's possible. And if the price is 1/10 by taking professors sitting in low-wage countries, I suspect that many universities around the world will start to use lower cost faculty or assistants in that way. So that's the sort of globalization that I'm talking about. Things that used to be provided locally, services, could now be offshored. In the book, I call it telemigration. In essence, that people are sitting in one country and through telecommunications migrating into another country and working there on a sustained basis. Now, the point I want to make at the bottom of this slide is that distance needs broader definition. So there tends to be a thinking about which jobs are offshoreable. And that's the wrong way to think about this. So just to back up a second, when COVID came, there was some very intensive, very high quality work done trying to figure out how many jobs were teleworkable. So I think the first example was Dingle and Neumann, who did it in the US. And it was reproduced by many countries all around the world, including in Japan. And what that did was said, this job is teleworkable, this one's not teleworkable, this is partly teleworkable, et cetera. It was a characteristic of the job. But when you look at telemigration, it's not just a characteristic of the job, it's a characteristic of the foreigners. So for instance, in Japan, much of the telemigration will require people to actually speak Japanese. And there aren't that many foreigners who do speak Japanese. Maybe if the opportunity arose, many more could learn it, but that's an example. So in some ways, India is much closer to the United States than it is to Japan because India speaks English, the US speaks English. So although it's in fact very, very far away, India and the US, in terms of this cultural distance, this working distance, it's much closer. So when we think forward about how globalization is going to go, we're going to have to think about what jobs are offshoreable and where are people in the world with much lower wages who have the cultural and linguistic affinity in order to, and underlying capacity to do those jobs. So I think we're going to find that some countries like Japan their globalization is going to be much less affected by this than countries like the United States, where English is a very widely spread language. Okay, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the future of work, the last topic. So what I would try to argue is that when we think about the future of work, we should be using a process of elimination. In the popular discourse, there's a tendency to ask what will be the jobs of the future. And I try and put on my thinking cap and I try and imagine jobs that we could do in the future or not. But I'm not an entrepreneur. And these are just ideas like this. I think it's more constructive if we think about what we won't be doing in the jobs of the future. This is the process of elimination. So in rich nations, I think we will be doing jobs that involve a lot of tasks that can't be automated or offshore. So when you think about what the nature of the jobs in the future will be, you have to think about what tasks in our jobs cannot be automated and cannot be offshored. Now here in the book, I write about this much more at length, but the basic idea is that AI, artificial intelligence, even with all this machine learning and whatnot, can't really do the most human tasks. And the reason for that is quite simply that it's hard to get a big structured data set on things like empathy or creativity or ethics or dealing with unknown situations or motivating large groups of people or connecting emphatically with students in order to improve their educational outcomes. Those things are so idiosyncratic and difficult and based on things that are difficult to be explicit about. It's very difficult to get big data sets on these most human of tasks. And without that data, machine learning can't train a computer to do that task. So the point here is that whatever the jobs of the future will be, they will involve a lot of these most human tasks because those can't be automated. And in terms of what can be offshored, we should look at tasks that involve cultural and linguistic peculiarities. So somebody working, let's say, in marketing or designing advertisement, they have to be deeply embedded in the local culture in order to send the right messages quickly. And that's something that's difficult to set to offshore. Moreover, there are some jobs where face-to-face is very important. And we found this with COVID, that some jobs are much easier to do remotely, and other jobs, especially innovative jobs, creative jobs, where everything is different and it's much easier to coordinate a team when you're actually in the same room in some sort of open space office, for example. So the tasks that really do require face-to-face or really do require local cultural or linguistic knowledge, those tasks will not be offshore. So when you put that together, it means the future of work in rich countries will involve lots of very human tasks that involve face-to-face. And that's whatever we're doing in those services, those will be the services that are sheltered from automation and offshoring. Now, in the poor nations, it's a little different because they're the ones who will be telemigrating into our. And it's not going to be, a large percentage of India is going to do this, but on the margin, that aspect will move towards it. So very much like the transformation that India saw with call centers and then business processing outsourcing, et cetera. I think in poor nations, it will continue that way. And so I would like to end by thanking you for listening and leave you with a picture of my book. So that's all I have to say. Thank you, Tetsu.